My name is Martin Dyar. I'm from Ireland, from the west of Ireland. County Mayo is home, but I live in Dublin. I've published a collection of poems, Maiden Names. I've written a play about the Irish poet Thomas Moore, and during my time in the residency, the last couple of months, I've been progressing a novel called Ursa Major, which is going very well. Well, I suppose being a writer full stop is a good thing. You have an unusual relationship with language. You're constantly on the lookout for material. So there's a pleasure in that. There's an excitement in that. That sweetens life a bit. Aside from, of course, the mania of it. I think the American novelist Philip Roth said on that point of I suppose the writer always daydreaming in normal interactions, how will this work on the page? He said it's not that everything is literature, but that everything can be, and I like that hook. I like the prickliness of that and the insight of that. But to be a writer in Ireland, I suppose is particularly special because of the tradition that's there. To be an Irish person and to feel the Irishness of the work of Joyce, of Beckett, of Yeats, of Brian Friel, of Seamus Heaney, to feel part of that, that artistic wealth is very, very special. As an Irish person and as an Irish writer, you have a particular access to that pantheon that the great Irish literature just feeds into your dreams, I suppose, and so there's always a sense of an exciting prospect and an exciting foundation. And then, of course, when you travel, people respond to you as an Irish writer in the light of the achievements of the great Irish writers, and that's fun. Ireland's a wonderful country. I love living there, but the weather is hard going. I write because I need to. I write in order to see, to rebel against my own ignorance whenever possible. I write in order to probe into the mystery of existence. I write in order to give voice to things or to people that strike me as perhaps being in danger of being overlooked or misrepresented. I write for pleasure, because language is magical. That's a sketch. That's a sketch. When I think about what's the most important Irish text for me, I can't escape the long story or the novella The Country Funeral by John McGahern. I'm a fan of John McGahern's work. It's a particular artistic peak for McGahern. He said so himself. Extraordinarily moving story. Two brothers returning home for a funeral. Their relationship, the idiosyncrasy of the country funeral itself, which really seems to capture so much about rural Ireland. The warmth of the prose, the sensuousness of it, the form of the story itself are all magical, and it's got McGahern's trademark kind of sociological warmth, his extraordinary ear for colloquialism, his extraordinary vision of underrepresented lives. So very, very, very special. I'm always looking for people who've read it, so I can talk about The Country Funeral by John McGahern, and it's in his collected stories. It was never published as a novella. I suppose it's fairly even. I'm excited by a great deal of American fiction and American poetry too. Perhaps naturally enough, poetry is my main art form. I wrote a PhD thesis on the American poet Wallace Stevens, so I've explored 20th century American poetry and taken great pleasure from it. But I respond to fiction in similar ways. I have the same need for fiction, can take the same pleasure in it. Although, because poetry is my locus, I suppose there's always the sense that I'm more tuned into the lyrical moments, and I might imagine that if there's several pages of realistic writing or of restraint, I'll imagine it as an extraordinary restraint, just holding off, just keeping the finger in the dam of the poetic impulse. But music is also tremendously important to me as well, and in terms of my own development as a writer, and I take great pleasure in lyrics. People like Leonard Cohen and Bob Dylan, and more recent songwriters like Bill Callahan or Will Oldham, and bands like The National. I had I think about a year-long obsession with the lyrics to the album Alligator by The National, and again going for a kind of a scent of poetry, going for a particular care with language, or back to the literary. I often think that my poetry has benefited from reading fiction to that extent that it loosens up the concentration or the focus on a more immediate goal, or even a tendency towards obscurity, and the extent to which perhaps it's helped me to think in narrative terms for poems, and I write in monologue form. Of course, I have the leaning towards theatre as well. I remember the Irish novelist Pat McCabe advising a group of us at one stage to think in terms of having a diet of an individual writer. I think he invoked Raymond Carver at the time. Take a diet of Raymond Carver for a couple of weeks and see what happens. I suppose kind of imagining a purging of dysfunctional tendencies, or a purging of too much care, so there's a lot of traffic between the forms and the genres. Yeah. Yeah, I absolutely do. I suppose thinking it in terms of literature, and we have a tremendous support system in Ireland. I'd feel very strongly that literary organisations, literary centres, theatres, and festivals be supported consistently, and not just annually, but with long-term programme funding, because they are a cultural lifeblood for the country, and they not only benefit the literary audience and a general audience, they benefit writers also. So there's a buoyancy for the literary arts that comes from that national governmental taxpayer investment in those structures. I also believe strongly that and inevitably writers need support. The key thing is time to write, time to develop. There's when I think of that, when I think of the necessity of support, and I think how I've benefited personally, I can't help but also think about the idea that the writer needs to be independent, needs to be prepared to drive towards writing their books at any rate, whether the support comes or not. And you cannot become dependent on that kind of support, that kind of occasional support. You cannot see it as your right. I think I often think of something William Faulkner said, which you could summarise as pencils and beans. I think he said pencils, beans and whiskey, but that's all he needed. And he'd labour for 50 hours a week. He would still write his novels. He saw himself as a machine, and it's very impressive, and of course threatening for any writer, any aspiring writer to read that and think about that. And but the drive has to be there, and for most writers, it's about embracing a period of a decade, a couple of decades, where you get up at 5 a.m. instead of getting up at 8 a.m. And that kind of stuff is inescapable. But in terms of bursaries, in terms of fellowships, in terms to the extent to which the state remains committed to those structures, to those opportunities, there is certainly a yield, there's certainly a result, because they benefit individual artists enormously. And and the work gets made, it becomes available. It's not my first trip to the States. I had time in Minnesota previously and Southern Illinois. I was in Southern Illinois for a year. I've been to the East Coast a couple of times, so I wasn't expecting to feel alienated in any way or feel foreign, but I do, and people treat me as exotic, and part of that is how friendly they are, and so I'm struck by that. I suppose that's the primary thing. People are tremendously friendly here. And they're interested to hear about where you come from. They seem just engaged by the idea that you have a different story, and that's been a defining feature of my time here. Not just the international writing program community and the university community, but at a general level in Iowa City itself. Just yesterday, I was on my way to the public library, and a woman stopped me and said, "Are you going to the library to vote today, sir?" And I said, "No, I'm a foreigner. I can't vote." And she said, "Well, we're glad you're here." And it was a really spontaneous thing, but I think characteristic of Iowa City. It's a lovely place to be. There isn't. I haven't been preoccupied by something in particular. If I think about my writing and the way people sometimes respond, I always welcome a considered response to an individual poem or to an individual line. You spend so much time on the work that any sign of somebody reading slowly or reading carefully or feeling something is tremendous. So I would always be very open to that. I find sometimes after public readings, people will come up and say the strangest things. People can be extraordinarily candid and confessional, as if the experience of the reading prompts something deeper, and they trust you somehow. I recently, during a reading where I had read a poem called Huckleberry Finn Day, which has in fact been turned into a chapbook by the International Writing Program here, to my delight, and it's a beautiful thing. Created in collaboration, of course, with Sherry DeGraw from Imperium Press. I read that poem recently, and an elderly man, a retired school teacher, as it happens, from Iowa City, wanted to ask me about the fact that when I had talked about the River Moy in County Mayo, which was the subject of the poem, I said the words "the River Moy," and he said, "We would never say the River Mississippi. It's the Mississippi River." And so we found ourselves in that place, and that curious kind of point of linguistic divergence. And later in the night, I had a lovely chat to that man. I went down to his car with him outside the venue. He wanted to give me a copy of a book as a gift. And as he got into his car, he said, "Now, when I'm driving home tonight, I'm going to cross the River Iowa." And it was a lovely exchange, and that was particularly special. Things like that can happen after readings, and I think that's the power of poetry. To whatever extent it is social, or to whatever extent it can communicate with people, it's very special, and it's obviously a great privilege to be having encounters like that. Yes, I'm going to read a poem from my book, Maiden Names. It's called The Badger. Go out, good sun. Traipse off across the hill. In dripping hood with lewd nocturnal eye. Go out and slouch across the walls of dawn, all aptitude and bluebell pride and tooth. Go out, my son, and stave a white-thorn beast. By ancestral grin and doggedness in rain. Defy, my son, the pasture, the imperial sheds. With nettle mind defy the piercing town. And when, by farming, son, the farms are lost, and tangled night becomes a badger's throne, then restore my fattened son. The digging way. Unlatch the earth. Release your father's bones.